Hi students, we are on page 19, but the pre-topic 5 interval notation that we're going to talk through here today. Okay, so interval notation is actually what you see in these middle two columns here. So we're going to talk about like how that comes up. And we're also going to talk about it in terms of inequalities. So we're going to do a little bit of two things here, but interval notation. So if we're talking about the idea of being between A and B, where A and B represent two different numbers, okay, but between A and B means not including A and B. And here in a second, you're going to see it say including them. We're just talking between. Then you are going to use parentheses around A and B. So it's going to be a parentheses A comma B parentheses. Now make sure you understand that these are all intervals. These are not coordinates. They're not ordered pairs. So that is not an X and a Y. Those are both actually X values in this case. So an example is the interval between -1 and 5, non-inclusive. Okay, so this interval right here means that at -1, I'm not including it because it's in the parentheses. At -1, I'm going to put an open circle, and at 5, I'm going to put an open circle, and I'm going to connect them. We're talking about everything that is in between those, not including the -1 and the 5. So the -1 and 5 aren't defined within that. Okay. Another way to look at this, so anytime that you're on a number line, we're talking about kind of X values. We're in that first unit of measure. And we look at the values that are between. So X is between. So we show what is less than X and we show what is greater than X. X is between -1 and 5. So that's the inequality notation. And if that makes sense, that kind of gives you an idea there that -1 is less than X, which is then less than 5, or X is between -1 and 5. So you have your interval notation and you have your inequality notation. Both of them mean the exact same thing. But again, you have to understand that these are intervals. These are not ordered pairs. Okay, so understanding interval notation, that's going to be a big deal. So the other types of interval notation is when you talk about between A and B, including A and B. So in this case, you're going to use the brackets. You're not going to use parentheses. This bracket means include A in your interval and include B in your interval. So here's the example right here of including 0 and including 3 and everything in between it. So to include 0, you're going to do a closed circle. So we talk about an open and a closed circle. And to include 3, you're going to do a closed circle. So you have these closed circles, and then you connect the dot because it's everything in between them. Okay, so that's between 0 and 3. Now, if you want to do that in inequality notation, you would do 0 is less than or equal to, we've used that symbol before, X, which is less than or equal to 3. So you have that same idea. Again, 0, 3 is not a point. It's not an ordered pair. It is an X value and an X value that these numbers are between. And we can also write that in that manner there. Okay, the next one, between A and B, including B. So we're only including B in this. So what you're going to notice is two different bracket symbols here. So we have a parentheses symbol because we're not including A, and we have a bracket because we are including B. So here's my example. So the parentheses is by the -4. So when I go to -4, I'm going to do an open circle. And when I go to 3, I'm going to do a closed circle. So we can have open and closed, and we can have those in either order, but we still connect the dots between them. It's that interval. So any values that are between those two dots there, okay? And then including the dot 3. Your inequality notation here then would be -4. You would say is less than X, which is less than or equal to 3. So using those equal to symbols. And if you understand those and that makes this inequality notation or interval notation make more sense, then use that to help it make more sense. Our last one here has between A and B, including A. So if you include the first value, so we have that square bracket here for A, and we have that parentheses for B. You see your example here, and we actually have infinity involved here, so we got a little bit of a different thing here. So we are going to put a closed circle on 2. So that's where we are starting, and an open circle on infinity. Now you never get to infinity. So infinity means we're going to have an arrow. Okay. So we're going to go to infinity, and I'm just going to say then that that's going to be this arrow over here. So we're going from 2 all the way up through there. So we can do that in interval notation as well. We can do our X with our less than symbols. We put a 2 over here, and since it's a closed bracket, we put the equal symbol, and over here we do an infinity. So we're doing everything that's above that. So those are the ways that we can do that. Now, the intervals can be X or Y, depending on what we have. When we go on one variable, it could even be an A interval, depending on what the variable is. But do understand that these interval notations, and if you're using um, inequality notation, that you could do it with a y in the middle, depending on what variable you're trying to work with. Infinity can never be in a closed bracket. So you never close infinity in because you can't actually get to infinity. So if we reverse that and we take and say, okay, what if we're given a graph and we need to write the inequality? What does that look like? So that's what these examples are. So here's an example here, and you can do it in two different ways. If you're looking at kind of the beginning and the end here, I have the -6 as the beginning, and it's going to end at the point of 1. And if I want to do inequality notation, I throw the x in the middle. And because it's always less than symbols here, so it's always -6 is less than x, which is less than 1. And because 1 is an open circle, don't put a line, and -6 is an open circle, don't put a line. So you can either use that or in interval notation. You can then say from -6 to 1. So you just do -6 comma 1. You do a parenthesis and a parenthesis to say that we're not including them. So either one of those says the exact same thing. If we move over here, I'm going on one side from -11 to the other side, so comma to 7. And then I have to pick my bracket. So it's a closed circle, so it's going to be a closed bracket. And it's a closed circle, so it's going to be a closed bracket. So that's how I write my interval. Again, understanding that that is not an ordered pair is one of the biggest things. Understanding that this is saying we go from -11, which is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 7, that whole interval. But again, those say the same thing there. Okay, our next two actually have two different intervals in them, and there are a few different ways to write this, but I'm going to go with interval notation here. So for this one, I first need to figure out these numbers. So this is at -7, this one's at -2, this one's at 1, and then we have an arrow there. So I'm going to write positive infinity so I can kind of recognize that. So my first interval here is going to be a closed bracket with a -7, comma, it goes to -2, and that's an open bracket or parentheses. Okay, and then we have a second interval, so I'm just going to put a comma in the middle here, and then we have a 1, and that's going to be a closed bracket, comma, and that's moving all the way to infinity. And anytime you write infinity, it's an open bracket. Okay, so you can do that. Now, once in a while, you may actually see somebody write a U in here. That just means in union with this. So we have these two united together. We don't have to do that. We can just put a comma in between. If you want to write this in interval notation, or in, sorry, I keep saying that, inequality notation, you would write -7 is less than or equal to x, which is less than -2, comma, then you would do 1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than infinity. So you could write either one of those as well. Okay, last one here. We've got negative infinity over here on this arrow. We've got a 1 right here. We've got a 3 on that open circle, and we have a positive infinity. So that's where we are going from and to. So my first one is an open bracket from negative infinity, comma, to 1 and a closed bracket. And then my next one is an open bracket with 3, comma, infinity, and a closed bracket. And you should make sure when you write these that it's always the smallest number on the left and the biggest number on the right for each one of them. And you kind of work from left to right or possibly bottom to top. Just to finish this off, the inequality here would be negative infinity is less than x, which is less than or equal to 1. And then 3 is less than x, which is less than infinity. Okay, thank you guys very much.